Swamiji makes an interesting extension of that commonly heard statement, "Cast not your pearls before swine." He was contrasting it to a popularly held idea among a very fundamental style of Christianity, that it's vitally important that we tell everybody the good news about Jesus Christ, because if we don't, then they're damned to hell forever. And it actually is an extraordinarily powerful motivating force. And in the name of that concern for the welfare of others, Christian missionaries throughout history have done extraordinary things. Gone to isolated places, risked their lives, sometimes lost their lives in this zealous cause. Master once said if missionaries also meditated, they could make very good spiritual progress if they had inner communion along with that outer zeal to serve. But this actual statement of Jesus is, don't give these spiritual teachings to everyone, because some people are simply not ready for it. And the idea that we can all be saved by Jesus is contrary to the fact, don't tell them. And because of protection for myself, they'll disregard it, they'll trample it, and then they'll, in fact, maybe do something awful to me as well. That's not really the martyr's attitude. The martyr's attitude is, I will die for my cause, and sometimes one needs to have that attitude. So there's a contradiction here. And the obvious and only explanation is that Jesus also realizes that we have all the time in the world, that sooner or later, everyone will come to a higher state of awareness, and then they'll be ready to hear. If you add back in to our understanding of what Jesus taught, all that Master says belongs in it, of reincarnation and the understanding of how evolution takes place over many lifetimes, and we gradually grow from ignorance into wisdom, many things that have since been removed from the Bible since the time that the Bible was written, then it all begins to make sense. Yogananda's mission was to bring the greater understanding expressed by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita as a light upon the teachings in the Bible, so that those who were schooled only in Christianity could actually understand what it is that Jesus intended. Yogananda puts himself forward as having the right to say this because he himself has the state of consciousness that Jesus had. This is a long discussion, and we will just assume it for purposes here today. In fact, Swami Kriyananda wrote the whole book, Revelations of Christ. And he wrote it, he said, for those who genuinely believe in Jesus and love Jesus, but are becoming terribly confused by the fact that the religion has been hijacked by politicians, by scholars, by novelists, and that fundamental feeling in the heart of devotion and oneness, and this inner realization that is much more of a vibration than an idea, is being undermined by all these seemingly reasonable, but somehow intuitively we know false ideas, but we can't quite put our finger on it. A friend wrote me recently saying that she started coming to this church, she's enjoying it a great deal, but someone who's very close to her is very, very skeptical about what she's doing. So when she comes back, she gets quizzed about what's going on here. And she finds herself absolutely certain when she's in this room and when she's in the presence of everyone else and we're singing and the vibration is there. And she goes home and she's asked all these very pointed questions and just finds herself, even to her own ears, sounding a little ridiculous in her explanation. Well, at the picture on the altar, there's this picture of this man, and, well, you know, he's still living in the Himalayas, and he has the power to regenerate his body, and he's promised to stay in his body, and he lives up there beyond the snow line, and he can take his advanced band of... Yeah. Sure. I mean, it just sounds silly even to anyone if you just say it just like that. But when you pick up Autobiography of a Yogi and you're immersed in Master's consciousness, his living vibration that comes out of that book, even if a piece of you is skeptical, another part of you doesn't dare reject it. Because we know, we feel it, we know. Swamiji said when he first came to be a disciple of Master, he was 22 years old. He had been a very intellectual man living on the East Coast, raised in Europe, and he read Autobiography of a Yogi. He'd never known anything about yoga or gurus or reincarnation or Himalayan masters or people materializing in a wheat field at the sincere prayers of their disciples. Page 8, Yogananda gives you no margin in that book. There's no sort of slowly lowering you into the story. On page 8, or maybe it's page 9, Lahiri Mahashaya materializes in a wheat field. They're just walking along and bingo, there's this man transported from another place just standing there. And it's not science fiction, and it's not sort of all this woo-woo, sort of the world fracturing and all this. He just kind of casually appears and carries on the conversation. And you read it, and it's perfectly natural. Swamiji said when he first went to Mount Washington, which is where he lived as a young monk at the age of 22, he said many people there would speak of many far-out things. Great masters living inside the Mount Shasta, for example, people from other planets inspiring them, visions of ancient warriors, walking the halls. And Swamiji said he only had one question. It didn't matter how far out it was. He said, did Master say it? Did Yogananda himself say it? And if Yogananda didn't say it, Swamiji felt he could exercise his normal intellectual discrimination. But if the origin of the statement was Master, Swamiji felt bound, not by his vows to Master, which he had already taken, but by his inner perception of the power and truth of his guru, and that no matter how far outside it went of his conventional understanding, Swamiji himself knew that his conventional understanding did not define the limits of what could be known, but somehow his intuition told him that this man could be trusted. Now, Swamiji writes how interesting it is in the Gita commentary, which is sort of a parallel verse, because Jesus is telling us, in a rather exaggerated, Swamiji says, a kind of hearty give-and-take way, indicative more of his humor than anyone when he says, cast not your pearls before swine. I mean, he's talking to some of the people around him. He's making fun of the people around him. And he could only do that if he were extremely mean-spirited or if he were having a good time with them. You could make a joke. You can say things that sound outrageous when you write them down later. But in the moment, it's part of the way people relate. So we feel like Jesus in this was actually being slightly humorous to make his point. But we come over to the Gita, which is the same verse, because the Gita also says, do not give these teachings to. That's what Jesus says. Do not give these teachings to those who haven't risen to the level where they can understand them. But everything in the Gita is so positive. So what it says is it lists virtues. And it lists virtues, and it says, don't give these teachings to those who do not have these virtues. But what it's also saying is, if you want to be able to receive these teachings, cultivate these virtues. So even the criticism is couched in a way to tell you which way to go. And here are the things that they speak of. Don't give these teachings to those who lack self-control or devotion, the willingness to serve others, who are not interested, or who speak ill of the Lord. Now, starting with just the first two are very interesting. Self-control is something that we all aspire to have, and at the same time, a great part of us resists, doesn't it? I mean, even there's a whole school of thinking that why bother to control yourself? Just do whatever you want to do. In fact, there was a very, very popular so-called spiritual movement, which was really a travesty against the idea of spirituality a few decades ago in the 70s when all of this was breaking loose in America. Extremely popular because the philosophy was this: well, it's all God, so just do whatever you want to do and just declare that it's spiritual. And in fact, we would all get together. They would all get together and just do whatever they wanted to do. They literally had something they called chaotic meditation, which was just sort of moving and yelling and just running around, doing whatever you wanted to do, because if you felt like doing it, it must be divine. Sounds good, sounds attractive for a while, but Jesus himself, when asked that question, how can you tell what's true from what's false? He says, by the fruits. That's all, just by the fruits. What do the people who practice it seem like to you? And of course, they seemed attractive to a certain number of people because it had its little flash in the pan, and then it died away, as these things do. When people are asking, how do you find your spiritual path? How can you tell if someone is your guru, especially if the guru in this case isn't even in the body? Well, you can tell by the fruits. Look at those who practice the teachings. Look at the fruit of devotion to this particular ray and see if it feels like something that belongs to you, something that you want to do. Every spiritual path has its unique characteristics. You can recognize sometimes who someone's master is, even which ashram they live in. There's a saying in the Bhagavad Gita, in the scriptures of India, not in the Gita, all of Krishna's soldiers looked like Krishna, is how it's put. And that meant that they're in tune with his consciousness. And being in tune with his consciousness, their very appearance, they resembled him in some way that you can't quite speak to exactly. I've noticed that sometimes when we have a large Ananda choir singing. And sometimes the ages can range from people in their 70s, even in their 80s, all the way down to young teenagers. And yet when everybody is singing, when they're standing there, they all look like themselves. But once they start singing, and their consciousness becomes just the vibration of the music, it's really remarkable to look at the group, and all age just sort of seems to fade away. Even gender fades away, because the body is just a manifestation of the vibrations that are flowing through it. There's no fixed reality to the material plane. It's just a pattern of energy held together by the thoughts and magnetism of the guiding force within it, in this case our individuality. And what we attune ourselves to, that we become. That's why married couples gradually begin to look like each other, and people begin to look like their pets. I'm sure you've seen it. Or we even choose our pets because in some way or another they look like us. When we would travel in India on our pilgrimages for a number of years, many times people would have a desire to bring back a statue of Krishna or a statue of Shiva or whatever they would like, and it would be part of the game of traveling, because the Indian shopping experience was very individualized. You find certain things in certain cities, and the shops are small. You can't see it in Macy's here and pick it up in Macy's in Varanasi later on. So there would be always, I'm still looking for my Krishna statue and so on. And then there would be the moment, I found my Krishna, and the person would come. They'd be so happy. We took over 20 years. We took hundreds of people to India. And I noticed something. People would finally find the statue that was perfect, and they'd hold it up like that, and the face would look like their own. And I don't think that's egotism. I don't think it was, look, I look just like God. It wouldn't be that at all. It would just be that there would be this attunement. And without even realizing it, it would look right to you when you looked at it. It looked like what a face was supposed to look like. I actually found it extremely sweet. Sometimes it would just be almost startling. Having looked at hundreds of statues, they would find just the one that reflected the consciousness they were in tune with. Now, coming back to wherever I was about the Gita here, we were talking about this aspect of self-control. There needs to be this understanding on the spiritual path before you can get anywhere with the teachings, that I have to not just live in the obvious world. And the self-control that's required is restraining ourselves from the obvious. If a child is there and there's a cookie on the table and the child wants the cookie, the child will just walk up and grab the cookie. And if somebody else wants the cookie, they'll just whomp the other kid in the head. There's this movie that they put out called Babies, which is really if you just really feel really soppy and you want to watch it, it's just totally charming. It's just babies. It's 4 babies all over the world, and the whole thing starts, and of course it looks exotic to us because it's not our culture, in some village somewhere out in the middle of the desert in Africa, and there are these 2 little babies about maybe a year apart. That they're just that size, or they can just barely toddle, and they have the big tummies, and they're African. They have they have nothing on but these beads and so on, and the 2 babies are next to each other, and it's a little boy and a little girl, and they're sort of imitating their parents, their mother, and kind of grinding something with a stone, And then one little girl reaches over and there's like an empty bottle that she wants, and sort of in the boys' area, and she takes it over like this. He leans over, he grabs it from her, then he just whacks her in the head like this, and she goes, throws her arms up, and then hurls herself on the stone. It was just hilarious. You know, just like it starts so early, doesn't it? Just like that. You know, he's aggressive and her response to it. You know, just men and women, there it is. If you don't believe in reincarnation, you will as soon as you see something like that. You know, and we think for a long, long time, let's just be this way. You know, we gradually have to be trained by our parents, and then we have to be trained by life itself, don't we? To imagine for a moment that something other than just whatever comes out of me is really going to bring me the happiness I seek. And so before you can even begin to think that maybe my reality is not created from outside, but emanates from my consciousness, there has to be sufficient self-control of those outward moving impulses for that idea to even make sense. And then he says, and you can't have these teachings unless you have devotion. This is out of the Gita. This isn't, this isn't somebody's just opinion about these things. And what's involved here is the intuitive knowledge of the heart. I read somewhere recently, I don't keep these things very clearly in my mind, but the scientific discovery was that people, the medical people are discovering that the physiological reality of the heart has many cells in it which are the same as the cells in the brain. And that, contrary to what people first thought, a great deal of the so-called thinking that we thought was only here is actually also in the heart. That we literally think with our hearts. Isn't that an interesting fact that sort of scientifically they begin to sort of move in to the ideas that have always been expressed in the scripture? Now, in the West, and especially in America, and perhaps even especially in Silicon Valley, we're really trained to be very astute with our minds. And the intellect is a very, very useful tool. It's not at all spiritual to become stupid. Sri Yukteswar said, saintliness is not incapacitating. His guideline was very direct. Learn to behave is how he put it. Which is the more we become advanced spiritually, the more insightful we should be in all areas. Sri Yukteswar, who was a Bengali holy man living in Calcutta, living in Puri by the ocean, Sri Yogananda writes in his autobiography that professionals from all fields could come in, doctors, lawyers, artists of all kinds, and even though Sri Yukteswar had no direct experience of their field of study, merely by the expansive attunement of his consciousness, he could discuss as if it was his field of interest, field of practice, with anyone on their terms. Because his consciousness was so expanded, saintliness is not dumbness. It is not incapacitating. And at the same time, though, the great power of the intellect is that it can analyze. It can sort of see this thing and that relationship and how this relates to this and how this can be done, and if we do that, then this will happen. But too much, the very nature of the intellect that way is it looks at all this diversity and it divides it up into specific pieces. And that's what we do when we analyze with our minds. And it has its place, because the inability to do that sometimes just causes people to make very foolish mistakes because they don't see how the interrelationship of things is. Somebody was joking recently, I don't have any money, so I'm going to do prosperity affirmations, but maybe I should stop buying clothes I don't need. Maybe that would be like a relationship to my prosperity. Instead of just doing these affirmations, maybe I shouldn't buy those $150 shoes if I can't afford it. The intellect also has to be in there to put the pieces together and see a simple cause and effect. Speaking of Sri Yukteswar again, he said, live comfortably within your means. That's how he put it, within your purse. But having said that thought, but the mind alone, it's like a little child when he takes a very complex thing apart and then doesn't know how to put it back together. Sometimes if we're always analyzing and see how this thing and that things work, we miss the point. And what the heart gives us, what devotion gives us, is an intuitive understanding of how everything resolves back into unity. And until we have that intuitive appreciation, how everything dissolves back in unity, it's very, very hard to understand these teachings. I can't tell you how many times over and over again over the years, and it's not that I tire of doing it, but it's just astonishing, but not surprising really, that it comes up again and again. Tell me about the law of karma. How can it be true that everything is really interrelated? How can it be true that I'm not actually being mistreated? How can it be true that this poor innocent child suffering over here, how can that just be karma? And my goodness, it's a very challenging thought. It's not like we can just casually sort of read this and see this and know that it's all okay. It tears us to pieces sometimes to see what goes on in the world. It tears us to pieces what happens to us. You know, what to speak of what happens to total strangers. It's very, very difficult. And the only way that we can begin to really have a relationship with God is that if somewhere, and it has to come first from the heart, there's just this intuitive understanding that there's a force in this universe that is good. And we cannot be persuaded of that by reason. Because if you just try to reason it out, it falls to pieces very fast. But somehow, because bliss is our true nature, because in fact we are loved by God, as the French saint put it, if you knew how much God loves you, you would die for joy. We go out into nature, we see a beautiful sunset, and something in us simply knows. Now, you can call that love, you can call it devotion, you can call it intuition, whatever you call it, but it's an absolute essential for the spiritual path. There must be some feeling that even though it doesn't look like it, this story has a happy ending. That's how I think about it in myself. Faith is the knowing that however long the story, however intense the adventures, however dynamic each of the chapters is, eventually this story has a happy ending. And until that intuition has been built, and again, no one can give that to you. No one can argue you into it. It's just somehow, somewhere, the longing of the heart becomes so intense that it breaks through and we have that experience. And then you can add to it. Then you can talk about this philosophy and this understanding and that understanding, but only when that devotion is there. And you see, that devotion is also based on self-control, because it's so much easier, it seems easier. It's a delusion, but it seems easier. I'm just going to be angry. I'm just going to be depressed. I'm just going to be victimized. I'm just going to feel like somebody did something to me. And in fact, somebody may have done something to you. Many somebodies may have done many things to you. You know, let us not be naive. Very difficult things happen. But sometimes in those very difficulties, we are so overwrought by our reaction that the reaction itself becomes worse than the initial issue. You read these wonderful stories in Reader's Digest and places like that, where the woman whose son was murdered becomes so embittered over that that finally she can't stand herself. And she goes to the prison and reconciles herself with the very person who murdered her son, and then becomes his friend, and then begins to help other prisoners. Where did that come from? That can't come from reason. That comes from some place in the heart that knows. And so ourselves, when we struggle against lack of faith in God, and it's very interesting if you use your mind to really think through every difficulty that you have in your life. If you follow it deeply enough, down to the absolute bottom of it, you always find it's a lack of faith in God. Because if God is fully in charge, if God lives within us, if Divine Mother knows, if Divine Mother is raising us to be that which we have the potential to be, how can anything that's happening be outside of that loving care? Many of you have heard me talk about a crisis I had in my life where I was very upset about something that was going on with people that I loved. And I was weeping and just fury and sadness. And in the midst of that emotion, this quiet voice just came in my right ear and sailed right through my brain. Do you think this could be happening outside the will of God? And I was so annoyed. You know, there's a certain satisfaction in just letting go, isn't there? You know, all the tension, women are very good at that. I just need to go home and have a good cry, women will say. You know, you do, and you feel better. You just sort of let down your guard and you cry, and then you come back and you're fine. And it's not really such a bad thing. But there's a great deal of satisfaction in just making it somebody else's fault. But then God said to me, do you think that I'm not in charge? Could you imagine for a moment that I don't know what's happening? Do you doubt my wisdom? Do you doubt my love? And thank God, I don't. Or at least I didn't in that moment. And so I just had to fold my arms and say, well, I don't much like this. You know, the conversation at least shifted. And it became a conversation between mother and child. Okay, mother, I'm going to do this because you're going to make me do it, but you really have to help me, and I'm only going to do it once. And we had what Master called, you talk to God, God likes it, Master said, when you speak your heart frankly. He likes it when you're open enough. Now you see, it takes a great deal of confidence, doesn't it? You have to love someone a lot to be able to really say what you think. You have to love someone a lot and trust them a lot to really have the courage to just say, I can't do it anymore, help me. And in that particular case, as soon as I shifted into that thought form, external circumstances also changed. Startling, isn't it? You know, often out of the greatest darkness comes the greatest effort to control ourselves, and out of that greatest effort to control ourselves comes the devotion, and then comes the bliss. You know? Much more could be said, but not this morning. So, God bless you.